It started with something that seemed so trivial, so completely unremarkable at first. I never could have guessed it would lead to such a shift between us. A quiet afternoon, one of those unassuming days where nothing stands out, nothing is particularly memorable. I was just sitting there folding clothes on the couch in the living room, towels, shirts, a pair of socks here and there, when I heard Jake's voice. "Lorraine, could you come here for a minute?" I paused for a split second, distracted by the low rumble of the washing machine, the hum that seemed to be filling the silence of the house. Turning toward the sound of his voice, I saw him standing in the hallway. He was at the bottom of the stairs, wrestling with the belt around his waist. The leather strap had twisted in a strange way, and it seemed to be giving him trouble. His shorts, a bit too big, hung loosely around his hips, and his expression, one of quiet frustration, made it clear that the problem wasn't something easily fixed. "Got it stuck or something," he said under his breath, taking a hesitant step toward me. His eyes were a little more serious than usual, almost pleading. Without saying it outright, he was asking for help. I set the towels down on the couch and stood, nodding. "Sure, I'll help." My voice was soft, barely above a whisper. As I walked toward him, I couldn't help but notice how uncomfortable he seemed. His posture was tense, and his hands hovered awkwardly around his waist, uncertain of how to handle the situation. I focused on the task in front of me, trying to pull the strap from the buckle, while his breath became slightly more pronounced, filling the space around us. "I'm sorry," I murmured, my fingers working quickly at the leather. But with a sudden jerk, the buckle released, and in that moment, everything seemed to slow. A silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken things. Jake stood there, frozen for a second, his face reddening as he quickly adjusted his position. "Uh, sorry," he stammered, his voice filled with an awkward edge as he avoided my gaze. His quick, almost frantic movement only seemed to make the tension more palpable. I turned away, my cheeks burning. "It's fine," I muttered, my voice wavering slightly. I took a couple of steps back, both of us standing there in the strange aftermath. The silence between us felt heavy, as if the air itself had thickened. Jake mumbled a quick thanks and hurried upstairs, his footsteps quick and uneven, as though he was trying to escape the awkwardness of the moment. I stood there, feeling the weight of everything we hadn't said. Was it really just an accident, a fleeting moment of discomfort, or had something more shifted between us that we hadn't yet acknowledged? From that point on, things between us were never quite the same. There was a subtle but undeniable shift, an invisible tension that seemed to alter the way we interacted. It was like walking around a fragile thread, careful not to disturb the balance. I would catch his eyes now and then, and he would quickly look away. The once easy rapport between us was now replaced by a strange form of distance, as if we were both trying to figure out how to be in the same space without acknowledging the shift. It was a week before either of us spoke about it. In the meantime, I went about my days, folding laundry, cooking, watching TV, but the unease hung over everything like a shadow. We exchanged fewer words, and when we did speak, there was a strained undertone. The tension was always there, just beneath the surface. One afternoon, as I was reading a book on the couch, I heard Jake's voice again. His tone was tentative, almost hesitant. "Lorraine?" I put the book down, my heart skipping a beat as I looked up. "Yeah?" I replied, trying to keep the nervousness from my voice. He appeared in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets, and there was something about the way he stood, relaxed but clearly uncomfortable, that told me this was the conversation we'd both been avoiding, the one that had been hanging over us since that afternoon. "I think we need to talk about the other day," Jake said, his voice trailing off as he looked away. I felt a knot form in my stomach. This was it, the moment we both knew was coming, but neither of us had wanted to face. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before finally meeting my gaze. "I don't really know how to explain it, but things feel different between us now. After what happened." The words hung there, unspoken, for a long moment. I nodded slowly, feeling the same unease settle in my chest. "Yeah," I whispered. "I feel it too." The silence stretched on, the space between us suddenly feeling much smaller, more charged. It was like the walls were closing in, pressing in on us from all sides. Neither of us knew exactly how to move forward, how to bridge the gap that had formed. I didn't mean for it to get weird, Jake said finally, his voice quiet. It just, it felt normal before, and now, I don't know what changed. I let out a slow breath, my heart racing. Neither do I said softly, looking down at the floor. But maybe we don't need to fix it. Maybe we just need time. Jake nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little. Yeah, he said quietly. Maybe you're right. I don't want things to stay weird. I just want us to be okay. In that moment, I realized that some things don't need fixing. Sometimes things just need time to breathe, to evolve on their own. Neither of us needed to force anything. We just had to let things unfold naturally. We stood there in silence, but this time, it didn't feel oppressive. It felt like a step forward. The conversation wasn't over, but it was the beginning of something new, something that didn't need to be rushed. Over the next few days, things felt a little easier. The air seemed to clear, just enough for us to interact without the same tension hanging between us. We still avoided the topic directly, but it was like we had come to an unspoken understanding. We were both willing to move past the awkwardness, to acknowledge it without letting it define us. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen counter, scrolling through my phone, when Jake walked in. A hesitant smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Hey, he said, his voice casual but still carrying an undercurrent of uncertainty. Hey, I replied, offering him a small smile in return. What's up? He leaned against the counter, glancing at the leftovers from dinner. I was thinking, maybe we could go out this weekend, just to get out of the house for a bit. What do you think? I was surprised. It wasn't like Jake to suggest something like this, especially not under these circumstances. I paused for a moment, wondering if he was trying to reconnect, or if it was just his way of easing the tension. Sure, I said, my voice lighter than it had been in days. I think we could both use a change of scenery. Jake smiled, and for the first time in a while, I saw the familiar comfort between us. Great. It's a date, then. I laughed softly at his words, raising an eyebrow. Just a friendly outing, I teased. He chuckled, clearly relieved that the conversation had taken a more familiar, playful turn. Right. Just a friendly outing. The weekend came, and we did go out. Just the two of us. It felt a little strange, like we were rediscovering each other. But there was something freeing about it, something that let us breathe a little easier. We went for a walk in the park, talked about everything and nothing, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe without the weight of unspoken things hanging over us. As we sat on a bench, watching the sunset, I realized that maybe this was what we needed. We didn't have to go back to how things were, and we didn't need to try to fix everything. Maybe time to heal, time to move forward, and time to rediscover the rhythm we once had was all we needed. Jake broke the silence with a soft sigh, his gaze thoughtful. I'm glad we did this, he said, his voice warm. Me too, I replied, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lift just a little. We sat in comfortable silence, letting the world pass by. The next few days felt quieter, but in a peaceful way. The unspoken tension that had been between us for so long now seemed to have settled into a more familiar, if still delicate, routine. We went about our days without the same undercurrent of discomfort that had once lingered in every glance, every word. It was almost as though we were learning to exist together again, not as two people walking on eggshells, but as two people rediscovering the rhythm of everyday life. Jake seemed a little more at ease around me. His once hesitant smiles had become more genuine, and the small moments we shared, like brief conversations over coffee or passing each other in the hallway, no longer felt so loaded. We didn't need to talk about everything, but there was something comforting in the silence that followed our awkward encounter. It was as if we had both agreed, without saying it aloud, that it was behind us. One afternoon after work, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Jake walked in, his footsteps light and unhurried. He leaned against the doorframe, watching me as I stirred the contents of a pot on the stove. I could feel his gaze on me. Not the heavy, uncertain kind from before, but the quiet, familiar sort I'd almost forgotten existed between us. Do you want to do something this weekend? He asked casually enough, though his eyes were searching mine. I paused, spoon in hand, and gave him a small smile. Like what? Maybe we could drive out to the coast, he suggested, sounding a little more enthusiastic than usual. Just the two of us. Get away for a bit. I know it's been a while since we've done something like that. It was the kind of suggestion I would have readily agreed to before everything had shifted between us. It felt like an invitation to return to something we had left behind, a chance to rediscover the connection we had once taken for granted. That sounds nice, I said, my voice soft and thoughtful. I think we could both use a change of scenery, just a little time away. Jake smiled at that, and I noticed a spark of something familiar in his eyes, relief maybe, or hope. The awkwardness had dissolved, but the road ahead still felt uncharted. A weekend trip might be just the thing to help us find our way back. Saturday came, and the drive to the coast was much quieter than I'd expected, but in a way it felt right. We drove in comfortable silence for a while, the hum of the road and the occasional turn of the wheel, the only sounds breaking the stillness. The landscape outside the car window changed as we left the city behind. Endless stretches of fields gave way to rolling hills, and soon we were approaching the coast, the salty air creeping into the car. When we arrived, we found a small cafe near the beach, nestled between the dunes, where the sand met the rocky cliffs. It was a quaint place, almost hidden from the busy tourist spots. We found a table on the terrace, overlooking the water. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was soothing, and the sea breeze felt refreshing against our faces. As we sat there sipping our drinks, I noticed how much easier things felt between us. There was still an underlying tension, something unsaid, but it was no longer a burden. It was like we had each given the other the space to breathe, to simply exist in each other's company without any expectations. We didn't need to talk about the past, about the awkwardness or the strange shift between us. Instead, we just were. It was comfortable, almost like we were reclaiming the connection we had once shared, not by forcing it, but by letting it unfold naturally. Jake broke the silence after a while, his voice quieter than usual, but with a sincerity that reached me. I'm glad we came here, he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the setting sun reflected off the water. Me too, I replied, my voice calm. It's nice to get away for a bit. We didn't need to say much more. The moment spoke for itself, the unspoken understanding between us that some things take time, that sometimes we don't need to force things to be perfect. We just need to allow space for them to grow, to evolve at their own pace. The rest of the weekend passed in a similar, quiet rhythm. We walked along the beach, talking about trivial things, letting the sound of the ocean wash over us. There were no awkward silences, no lingering tension. Instead, it was like we were two people who had found a way back to each other, not by rushing into anything, but by simply being present. On the drive back, the conversation picked up easily, and the distance between us, emotional and physical, seemed to close just a little more. It wasn't a dramatic change, but I could feel it. We were no longer walking on eggshells around each other. We were finding our way back to the rhythm we had once known, and that was enough for me. Back at home, things continued to improve, though we were careful not to rush anything. We didn't need to talk about everything that had happened, but we both understood that what had transpired wasn't something that could be erased. It was simply something we would learn to live with. The small moments that had once seemed so unremarkable now held more weight, more meaning. And through that, we were finding a new understanding. In the days that followed, we returned to the simple things. Sharing a meal, watching a movie, spending a quiet evening in the living room, each of us comfortable in our own space. It felt like we were learning how to be around each other again, not as two people trying to fix something, but as two people moving forward together, imperfectly but honestly. I wasn't sure where things would lead, but I no longer felt the pressure to force a resolution. For now, the space between us was just right, a place where we could breathe, where we could continue to grow, both individually and together. And that, I realized, was enough.